Never step into unfamiliar mansions no matter how desperate you are, whether your car breaks down or you need to make a call. You can never know who or what might be waiting inside. Unfortunately for Emily and Jacob, they learned this the hard way. The snowstorm descended without warning, turning the serene mountain road into an icy, impassable trap. Jacob wrestled the steering wheel as their car skidded to a halt. The engine sputtered and died, leaving him and his girlfriend, Emily, stranded in the growing cold. "Look over there," Emily said, pointing through the swirling snow. A dark silhouette of a building loomed ahead. They grabbed their coats and trudged toward it, the wind biting at their faces. The structure was massive, with cracked windows and a faded sign above the entrance that read, Crest Haven Asylum. Its eerie facade sent a chill down Emily's spine. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We don't have much choice," Jacob replied, pushing the heavy doors open. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, carrying an unsettling silence. Dust-covered furniture and rusted medical equipment littered the hallways. Emily's flashlight illuminated the peeling wallpaper, revealing faded murals of serene landscapes, a stark contrast to the sinister aura of the asylum. As they explored, they found patient records scattered across the floor. One file caught Emily's eye. A young woman named Alice had been committed for hearing voices. The notes described her descent into madness, claiming she often spoke of shadowy figures that watched from the corners. "Let's just find a room and wait out the storm," Jacob said, his voice tight. They chose a small office, barricading the door with a desk. But the asylum was not as abandoned as it seemed. The first sign came at midnight, a faint tapping at the door. Jacob froze, exchanging a fearful glance with Emily. "It's probably the wind," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Then it stopped, replaced by the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. "Who's there?" Jacob called, his voice cracking. No reply came, only the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. Emily clutched his arm. "We need to leave, now." They cautiously opened the door, stepping into the darkened hallway. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally under their flashlight beams. The sound of whispering voices grew louder, though they couldn't see anyone. They reached the main corridor, only to find the entrance doors wide open despite the raging storm outside. Snow blew in, but a set of footprints led deeper into the asylum. "Those weren't there before," Emily whispered, her breath visible in the freezing air. Suddenly, a figure darted across the hallway ahead, too fast to see clearly. Emily screamed, and Jacob yanked her back into the shadows. Desperate to escape, they followed signs to what appeared to be a staff exit. But the deeper they went, the more the asylum seemed to shift. Hallways they had passed earlier now led to unfamiliar places. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the walls seemed to close in, adorned with new graffiti. "Leave while you still can." They stumbled into a large room filled with rusted hospital beds. On one of them lay a figure, a woman in a tattered hospital gown, her head turned away. "Miss, are you okay?" Jacob asked, inching closer. The woman sat up suddenly, her head swiveling unnaturally to face them. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth twisted into a scream that echoed through the asylum. Jacob and Emily ran, their flashlight flickering. They burst into another hallway only to find it lined with shadowy figures, their faces obscured, but their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The figures began to move, shuffling toward them. The couple darted into a nearby room, slamming the door behind them. But the walls of the room were covered in writing, scratched into the paint and plaster. The same phrase repeated over and over, "They never let you leave." The door creaked open slowly, and the figures entered, their footsteps silent. The storm finally subsided the next morning, revealing the car still abandoned on the roadside. But Jacob and Emily were never found. The only trace of them was a pair of footprints leading to the asylum, which now stood eerily silent, as though waiting for its next visitors. The wind cut like a blade through the desolate village of Frost Hollow, howling with a bitterness that seemed almost alive. The streets lay deserted, blanketed in snow that muffled every sound except for the occasional creak of wood under the strain of the cold. For generations, the villagers had lived under the shadow of a chilling legend, one they didn't dare question or defy. The ice harvesters, they said, were not just a story told to frighten children, but a grim reality of their isolated, frozen world. The legend warned of spectral figures who emerged on the harshest winter nights, stalking the wilderness with their frost-forged tools, harvesting more than just the ice. They came for those who strayed too far from the safety of home. Some claimed they were spirits of those who had perished in the cold long ago, cursed to roam forever, feeding on the warmth and life they had lost. Others whispered they were older, ancient beings tied to the ice itself, awakened only in the depths of the coldest winters. Marcus arrived in Frost Hollow on the eve of one such winter. A seasoned traveler and photographer, he sought the raw beauty of untouched snow and frozen landscapes to add to his portfolio. He wasn't one to believe in folklore, and he certainly wasn't going to let a few superstitious warnings ruin his plans. The villagers, however, were less enthusiastic about his bravado. At the small, dimly lit tavern where Marcus warmed himself on his first night, the locals exchanged uneasy glances as he asked about the best trails and scenic spots. "Stay indoors after dark," one man muttered before hastily leaving. Old Greta, the tavern's owner, was less subtle. As she handed Marcus a mug of steaming cider, she leaned in close, her wrinkled face grave. "You don't understand what you're risking," she said, her voice trembling. "The ice harvesters are not a tale, boy. They come when the wind carries their whispers. Stay inside. Whatever you do, don't stray into the forest at night." Marcus gave her a polite smile and a dismissive nod, but inside, he felt a flicker of unease. The conviction in her voice was unsettling, even if he didn't believe in ghost stories. The next evening, armed with his camera, thick winter gear, and a lantern, Marcus ventured into the wilderness. The sun dipped below the horizon in a fiery blaze, leaving the forest bathed in a silver glow under the rising moon. Snow crunched underfoot as he trudged along a frozen creek, marveling at the pristine beauty around him. Hours passed as Marcus worked, his focus consumed by framing the perfect shots. He barely noticed when the wind fell silent, the usual rustle of the trees and distant cries of night animals replaced by an eerie stillness. It wasn't until he heard the first sound, a faint rhythmic scraping, that he froze. It came again, like metal dragged across ice, distant but distinct. He turned slowly, his lantern casting long shadows across the snow. The forest was empty, or so it seemed. Then came the whispers. At first, they were soft, almost imperceptible, carried by the wind. But they grew louder, more insistent, surrounding him with words he couldn't understand. His heart pounded as he swung the lantern wildly, its flickering light illuminating nothing but endless snow and skeletal trees. And then he saw them. At the edge of the light, shadows shifted unnaturally, moving against the direction of the moonlight. They grew darker, more defined, until they coalesced into humanoid shapes cloaked in frost and shadow. Their faces were voids, save for the piercing, icy blue glow of their eyes. In their hands they carried tools, scythes, axes, and sickles, glinting like shards of pure ice. Panic surged through Marcus as the figures began to advance, their movements fluid and deliberate. He stumbled backward, nearly dropping his lantern, his breath coming in ragged clouds. The whispers transformed into a chilling chant, a rhythmic cadence that seemed to resonate within his very bones. "Foolish wanderer, you were warned. Now you will pay." Marcus turned and ran, the snow dragging at his boots like quicksand. No matter how fast he moved, the figures followed effortlessly, gliding across the snow with an otherworldly grace. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel their presence, the weight of their gaze bearing down on him. The landscape seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally, every path leading him deeper into the forest. The trees loomed closer, their branches clawing at him as if trying to drag him back. His lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, but fear pushed him onward. Finally, he stumbled into a clearing, collapsing into the snow. His lantern flickered weakly, the flame barely clinging to life. As he looked up, he realized with a sinking dread that he was surrounded. The ice harvesters stood in a perfect circle, their tools raised. The whispers grew deafening, drowning out the sound of his own frantic breathing. Marcus screamed, a primal sound of terror and despair, but it was swallowed by the cold night. The last thing he saw was the sharp glint of frost and the icy glow of their eyes. The next morning, old Greta found Marcus's camera near the forest's edge, its lens shattered and dusted with frost. The villagers knew what had happened, though none dared speak of it aloud. In Frost Hollow, the legend of the ice harvesters lived on, a warning to all who would dismiss the power of the frozen wilderness and the shadows that lurked within. The snow fell in a steady, cold blanket as the group of hikers pressed on through the thick wilderness. Their breaths came out in misty clouds as they trudged up the steep incline, their faces buried beneath layers of clothing. The wind howled through the trees, whipping against their skin and stealing what warmth they had left. With every step, the blizzard grew stronger, the swirling snow obscuring their view of the path ahead. Jason, their leader, paused to check his map. "We need to find shelter soon. This storm is getting worse," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. Everyone agreed. The group had been hiking for hours, caught in the unrelenting weather without much choice but to press forward. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they carefully navigated the frozen path. That's when something caught Sarah's eye. She stopped, frowning, and motioned for the others to halt. "What is it?" Mark asked, brushing snow off his face. Sarah pointed. "Look over there. Do you see it?" Jason squinted through the snow and suddenly, just at the edge of visibility, he saw a faint outline. The shape of buildings, roof lines poking through the white haze like bones rising from the earth. They looked old, their wooden beams sagging beneath the weight of time and snow. His heart sank. "Is that a village?" Sarah asked, her voice hesitant. "I think so," Jason replied, trying to steady his nerves. The thought of finding shelter brought him both relief and unease. "Let's check it out. Maybe there's a cabin or something we can use to wait out the storm." They followed the rough outline of the buildings as the snow continued to drift. The wind pulled at their clothing, freezing their fingers and toes as they walked. The buildings grew clearer as they approached, a row of crooked houses, their chimneys venting nothing but cold air. Everything was coated in snow, and the windows were dark, but there was something off about the stillness. As they stepped into the village itself, the air seemed colder, heavier, as though they had passed into another world. The buildings were dilapidated, their wood warped, their windows shattered and covered in frost. They had the appearance of abandonment, old shutters hanging loosely, sagging porches, and front doors that creaked when the wind pressed against them. It all looked like the sort of place that could have been deserted for decades. But as they looked closer, Mark noticed something strange. His breath caught as he pointed toward the snow-covered path leading between two of the buildings. "There are footprints," he said, his voice low. Everyone turned to look. Jason frowned. "What are you talking about?" Mark gestured to the snow. Sure enough, footprints, large, deliberate ones, led through the snow toward the center of the village. They looked fresh, too fresh to have been there for weeks. Jason's heart started to pound. "They could be from anyone," he said, trying to shake his unease. "Maybe travelers or locals. Let's just find shelter." The group moved cautiously through the snow, the blizzard pushing at their backs. The wind whistled through the buildings, and the sound of their breaths and the snow crunching underfoot was all that filled the air. But then Sarah gasped. "Did you hear that?" The others froze. They strained their ears against the wind. At first, they heard nothing. But then came a sound, faint and distant, like the creaking of boots on snow. And then, a whisper, a low, unintelligible murmur. Jason frowned, his heart sinking further. It's probably just the wind, he tried to assure himself, but his voice was shaky. They pressed on, though none of them could shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, they would catch movement just at the edge of their vision. Shadows darting behind windows, figures in the distance, shapes that seemed too deliberate, too human to be random. Jason told himself it was only their imagination, the wind or the fatigue playing tricks on them. But it wasn't enough to quiet the gnawing unease. The group came upon a large church in the center of the village. Its tall steeple jutted out into the snowy sky, its windows frosted and cracked. It looked ancient, as though it had sat here for centuries, forgotten by time itself. The building loomed in front of them, and Sarah spoke up. "Let's check inside. Maybe there's a place we can wait until the storm dies down." Before anyone could object, Sarah pushed open the heavy wooden door of the church. The cold air rushed in as the door groaned on its hinges, revealing a dark, dim interior. The air smelled of mildew and old wood, and the sound of dripping water filled the silence. They stepped inside, and the door closed behind them with a resounding thud. The interior of the church was cold and damp. Their breath fogged as they stood in the gloom, struggling to see. Their eyes adjusted, and they could make out the outlines of old pews, an ancient altar, and stained glass windows that had long since lost their color. The snowstorm outside barely penetrated the stone walls, but the air still felt freezing. "Stay close," Jason whispered. He could feel his hands trembling, but he wasn't sure if it was the cold or something else. "Let's just rest here for a moment." They huddled together, their breaths ragged. But as they tried to gather their thoughts, the sounds began again. This time it was louder. A faint creaking, footsteps, whispers, and then the sound of something scraping against the stone. Everyone froze, their hearts pounding. "It must be the wind," Mark whispered. But then they heard it again. A voice this time, low, raspy, and unmistakably human. "Help!" The sound came from outside. Everyone turned toward the door, but before they could react, they heard more footsteps, heavy footsteps. They sounded deliberate, calculated. It was no longer just a sound in the wind. It was movement. They weren't alone. They tried to open the door, but it refused to budge. The storm had grown stronger, the wind pressing against it with an icy force. Panic gripped them as they realized that they were trapped. The whispers came louder now, accompanied by distant figures in the snow, a line of dark figures just beyond the reach of their vision. The snow shimmered in eerie shapes, as though the figures were waiting for them, watching. Jason tried to shout, but his voice was lost to the storm. The figures came closer, and as they did, the sound became clear. It was not just a whisper or groan, it was a voice, a chorus of voices, murmuring, pleading, and then, as if in unison, "Come!" The figures in the snow were drawing near. The village wasn't empty, not at all, and they would never escape.